Lauren had always been a light sleeper, so when she first noticed Ethan shifting restlessly in bed, she didn't think much of it. He had been under a lot of stress lately, working long hours and barely getting enough rest. But as the nights passed, his movements became more frequent and more unsettling. At first, it was just small things. He would sit up suddenly in the middle of the night, eyes open but unfocused, muttering things she couldn't quite understand. She would reach out to touch his arm, whispering his name, but he wouldn't respond. Then, just as quickly as he had woken, he would lie back down and continue sleeping as if nothing had happened. She told herself it was just exhaustion taking its toll, but soon it escalated. One night, she woke to the sound of the bedroom door creaking open. Confused, she sat up and saw Ethan walking out of the room. At first, she thought he was just heading to the kitchen for water or maybe the bathroom. But after several minutes of silence, she got up to check on him and found the front door slightly ajar. A cold chill ran through her as she hurried outside. Ethan was standing on the porch, staring out into the night, his breath visible in the crisp air. She called his name, stepping closer, but he didn't react. His eyes were open, but there was something vacant about them, as if he wasn't really seeing anything at all. Gently, she placed a hand on his arm, and only then did he turn to look at her. His face was blank, emotionless, as though he wasn't fully present. She guided him back inside, whispering reassurances, and once he was back in bed, he fell asleep instantly. The next morning, she asked him about it, but he had no memory of leaving the room. He laughed it off, saying maybe he had a weird dream or was just restless. But Lauren wasn't convinced. Over following nights, it happened again. Each time, he would rise without warning and leave the bedroom, making his way to the front door. She started locking it, but even in his sleepwalking state, he seemed to know where the key was. He would unlock it, step outside, and just stand there, motionless, staring out into the darkness as if something was calling him. Lauren began staying awake later, waiting for him to move. She recorded him on her phone one night, hoping that maybe showing him the footage would make him realize how strange it was. But when she played it back the next morning, he just shook his head and muttered that he must be under too much stress. He promised he would try to get more sleep, but Lauren knew something wasn't right. Sleepwalking wasn't unheard of, but Ethan had never done this before, not in all their years together. And it wasn't just the fact that he was walking in his sleep. It was where he was going. One night, as she followed him from a distance, she noticed something even stranger. He wasn't just wandering aimlessly. His steps were purposeful, as if he was following a path only he could see. His movements were slow but determined, his gaze fixed straight ahead. Lauren's heart pounded as she walked behind him, careful not to wake him, afraid of what might happen if she did. He walked past the yard, down the driveway, and continued toward the street. That's when she realized he was heading somewhere. She had no idea where, but it wasn't random. It was deliberate. Lauren couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that something was deeply wrong. Ethan's sleepwalking wasn't just a case of mild restlessness. It was leading him somewhere, and the fact that he seemed to know exactly where he was going sent chills down her spine. She started keeping a notebook by the bed, documenting the time he got up, how long he was gone, and any small details she noticed. Over the next few nights, she confirmed what she had already suspected. He followed the same path every single time. No hesitation, no deviation. It was as if he had done this walk 1,000 times before, even though she was certain he had never left a house like this until recently. The logical side of her wanted to believe there was a rational explanation. Maybe he had repressed stress. Maybe this was some kind of subconscious habit, or maybe his mind was reliving an old memory. But the way he walked, the sheer determination in his steps, made her feel like something much deeper was at play. One night, after waiting for Ethan to start his routine, Lauren made a decision. She wasn't just going to follow him from a distance. She needed to see where he was going. He left the house as usual, moving like a man caught in a dream, and she trailed behind him, her breath tight in her chest. The streets were eerily quiet, the occasional flickering street lamp casting long shadows on the pavement. Ethan never hesitated at intersections, never stopped to think about which way to turn. He just kept moving forward, as if an invisible force was guiding him. As she followed, she realized that he was leading her farther than before. The farther they walked, the more unsettled she felt. They were now in an area neither of them had any reason to visit, an older part town where most houses sat abandoned or in disrepair. Lauren's pulse quickened. Why here? Why this place? Ethan finally stopped in front of a house that looked completely unremarkable, yet something about it made Lauren's stomach twist. The wooden exterior was worn, the windows dark and hollow, as if the house itself had been forgotten. Ethan stood at the entrance, hand on the doorknob. Lauren hesitated, suddenly afraid of what she might find inside. The moment his fingers wrapped around the knob, she made a sound, a quiet, involuntary gasp. Ethan turned instantly. His expression was still blank, but for the first time since it started, he looked directly at her. Lauren froze. He wasn't awake. He wasn't really seeing her. But something in his subconscious seemed to sense her presence. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears as she slowly stepped backward, afraid of what he might do if she startled him too much. She had read that waking a sleepwalker could be dangerous, and now she fully believed it. Ethan's hand hovered over the doorknob for a long moment before he slowly lowered it and turned away from the house. Then, without another word, he walked past her and started heading home. Lauren barely breathed as she followed him, her hands trembling. He never spoke, never acknowledged her. It was as if she hadn't been there at all. When they arrived back at the house, he walked inside, climbed into bed, and fell into a deep sleep. The next morning, Lauren asked him how he had slept, searching for any sign that he remembered what had happened. But Ethan just rubbed his eyes and shrugged. "Fine, I guess," he said, yawning. "Why?" Lauren forced a smile, trying to keep her voice even. No reason. But she knew she was lying. This wasn't just sleepwalking. He had led her to that house for a reason, and she had to find out what it was. Lauren spent the entire day trying to shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The image of Ethan standing in front of that house was burned into her mind. She kept replaying the moment when he had reached for the doorknob, when it turned toward her as if sensing her presence, even in his sleep. There was something unnatural about it, something intentional. She had seen sleepwalkers before, on videos and stories, but this was different. He wasn't just wandering aimlessly. He was following a path that had been imprinted in his subconscious, one that led directly to that house. She had to know what it was. That evening, while Ethan was at work, Lauren sat at the kitchen table with her laptop open. She typed in the address of the house he had led her to, hoping to find anything that could explain its significance. At first, she found nothing. Just old property records, outdated listings, an abandoned ownership history. But then, after digging through archived local news articles, she stumbled across a headline that sent a shiver down her spine. Local woman goes missing. Search continues after mysterious disappearance. Lauren's stomach twisted as she clicked on the article. The story was dated 10 years ago. A woman in her early 30s, named Rebecca Hayes, had disappeared without a trace. She had lived alone, and one night, a neighbor had reported seeing her leaving her house barefoot, in her nightgown. According to the article, she had looked dazed, confused, like she wasn't really awake. Lauren's pulse spiked. She scrolled further, scanning the details. Police had searched for her for weeks. No signs of forced entry in her home. No known enemies. No history of mental illness. The case had gone cold after a few months, fading into another unresolved mystery. But then Lauren saw something that made her entire body freeze. A photo of Rebecca Hayes. And standing beside her, his arm casually draped around her shoulders, was Ethan. Lauren's breath caught in her throat. She stared at the image, heart pounding, as if trying to will it into being something else. Ethan had never mentioned this woman. Not once. She scrolled through the article again, searching for any mention of his name, but there was nothing. No connection to the investigation. No sign that the police had looked into him. She felt a wave of nausea rising. Why had Ethan never told her about Rebecca? And why, after all these years, was he suddenly sleepwalking to the house where she had disappeared? Lauren slammed the laptop shut, trying to steady her breathing. She couldn't bring this up to Ethan. Not yet. If she asked him about it, he would just deny it, maybe even get defensive. No, she needed to see for herself. So that night, she made a decision. She wasn't just going to follow Ethan again. This time, she was going to go inside. As the hours passed, she felt her nerves growing. She told herself she was overreacting, that there was an explanation for all of this. But deep down, something in her whispered that she was about to uncover something she wasn't supposed to find. When Ethan finally stirred in his sleep, she was already wide awake. She watched as he sat up, his breathing slow and steady, his body moving with that eerie certainty. He slid out of bed and made his way toward the door, and just like before, he stepped outside and began walking. Lauren grabbed her coat and followed. Her hands were ice cold as she moved through the quiet streets, staying just far enough behind that he wouldn't sense her. She told herself she was ready for whatever she might find. But when they reached the house and Ethan pushed open the unlocked door, every instinct inside her screamed to run. Instead, she took a deep breath, clenched her fist to stop them from shaking, and stepped inside after him. Lauren hesitated in the doorway, her heart pounding so loudly that she swore Ethan would hear it. The house was dark and silent, the air inside thick with dust and an unsettling stillness. The wooden floor creaked beneath her cautious steps as she followed Ethan deeper into the house. He moved with that same eerie certainty, navigating the space as if he had been here 100 times before. Lauren barely breathed as she kept her distance, afraid of what she might witness. The living room was frozen in time, filled with outdated furniture covered in dust. A single-framed photograph sat on the fireplace mantel. Even in the dim light, she could make out the face in the picture, Rebecca Hayes, the woman who had vanished 10 years ago. Lauren swallowed hard, her fingers trembling as she lifted the photo for a closer look. There was something deeply unsettling about the way Rebecca smiled, like a person frozen in a moment they had no idea would be their last. Behind her, Ethan suddenly moved. Lauren tensed, watching as he walked toward a door at the end of the hallway. He didn't hesitate before pushing it open and stepping inside. She forced herself to follow, inching toward the room as quietly as she could. The air grew colder as she approached, a dampness clinging to the walls. When she peered inside, she had to cover her mouth to stop a gasp from escaping. The room was not empty. In the center, a small wooden chair faced a table covered in old, yellow papers. Ethan stood in front of the chair, his hands at his sides, eyes wide but unseeing. Lauren took a step closer, her pulse hammering. The papers on the table looked like journal pages, covered in hastily scribbled handwriting. She reached out, carefully picking up one of the pages. The ink had faded, but she could still make out the words. "He comes at night. He doesn't know I can hear him." Lauren's breath caught. Her hands shook as she reached for another page. "I lock the doors, but he always finds a way in." Her stomach churned as she flipped through more pages. Some were filled with paranoid ramblings, others with fragmented thoughts. But the last entry sent a chill down her spine. "Tonight will be different. Tonight, I won't let him take me." Lauren's hands went cold. She slowly turned to look at Ethan, still standing motionless in front of the chair. His expression hadn't changed, but now his lips were moving. She stepped closer, barely able to hear the words he was whispering. "I didn't mean to. I didn't mean to." Lauren felt the room tilt around her. A sickening realization crept into her mind. Rebecca Hayes hadn't just disappeared. She had been taken. And Ethan's subconscious had brought him back to the place where it happened. Lauren felt her knees weaken as her mind tried to reject the possibility. Had Ethan been involved? Had he repressed a memory so deeply that his body had started retracing the steps without him even knowing? She felt like she couldn't breathe. Her entire world was shifting beneath her feet. And then, Ethan suddenly turned his head. For the first time that night, he looked directly at her. Lauren froze. His eyes were wide, unfocused. His lips parted slightly, as if he was about to speak. And then, he woke up. The awareness returned to his face in an instant. His eyes darted around, taking in the dimly lit room, the table, the papers, Lauren. A deep confusion twisted his expression. What is this?" he murmured. His voice was hoarse, as if he had just been pulled out of a deep sleep. Lauren couldn't answer, because she didn't know which would be worse. That Ethan had been hiding this from her all along, or that he truly had no idea what he had done. Ethan stood in the dim light of the abandoned house, his breathing uneven as his eyes darted around the room. Lauren could see the moment panic set in. He took a step back, running a hand through his hair, his fingers trembling slightly. His confusion was real, or at least, it looked real. She wasn't sure if that made things better or worse. "What is this place?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Lauren felt like the ground beneath her was shifting. Should she tell him the truth? Should she ask if he remembered anything? Her instinct screamed at her to be careful. "You don't know?" she asked instead, keeping her voice steady. Ethan shook his head slowly. "No, I have no idea how we got here." Lauren felt her stomach tighten. "You brought us here, Ethan. You've been coming here in your sleep for the last few weeks." His face drained of color. "What?" Lauren clenched her fists, trying to keep herself grounded. "I followed you. I watched you leave the house at night and walk here like you knew exactly where you were going." Ethan took another step back, looking more lost than ever. That's impossible." Lauren swallowed hard. "It's not, and that's not the worst part." She gestured toward the table covered in old, yellow papers. "Do you recognize any of this?" Ethan's eyes flickered toward the table, scanning the words. His expression shifted from confusion to unease, and then to something darker. His hand reached out hesitantly, brushing against one of the pages. His fingers trembled as he picked it up, his gaze locking onto familiar handwriting. Lauren watched him closely. "Ethan, do you remember Becca Hayes?" At the sound of the name, he froze. It was only for a second, but it was enough. His whole body tensed, as if something deep inside him had stirred. Something buried. He started, but his voice caught. Lauren stepped closer. "You knew her, didn't you?" Ethan exhaled sharply, shaking his head as if trying to clear it. "I don't know. Maybe. It sounds familiar, but..." His voice trailed off as he clenched his jaw. Lauren felt her pulse spike. He was remembering something. "I found an article about her," she continued, keeping her voice calm but firm. "She disappeared 10 years ago. The last time anyone saw her, she was walking barefoot out of this house, just like you've been doing." Ethan's hands clenched into fists. "This doesn't make sense," he whispered. "Why would I?" Lauren's voice softened. "I don't know, Ethan, but I need you to be honest with me. Were you involved in her disappearance?" His head snapped up, eyes wild. "No, of course not." The intensity in his voice made her take a step back. He ran his hands over his face, exhaling shakily. "I swear, Lauren, I don't remember any of this." Lauren studied him carefully. He looked genuinely terrified. But if he truly had nothing to do with Rebecca Hayes, why was he coming back here? She took a deep breath. "Then we have to figure out why your mind is leading you here." Ethan looked at her, his eyes filled with a fear she had never seen before. "What if I don't want to remember?" Lauren felt her throat tighten, because deep down, she was starting to wonder if maybe, just maybe, he was right. Lauren felt a lump forming in her throat as she watched Ethan struggle with the weight of his own thoughts. He kept shaking his head, rubbing his temples, as if trying to force memories to surface, or maybe trying to push them back down. She could see it, the battle happening inside him, the desperate need to not know, but she couldn't let him walk away from this. "Ethan, you have to try," she said, keeping her voice steady despite the storm inside her. His eyes snapped to hers, wide and full of something she couldn't quite place. "What if I don't like what I remember?" Lauren took a slow breath. "Then at least you'll know." He exhaled sharply, turning away for a moment, then hesitated before facing her again. His voice was barely above a whisper. "What if I'm the reason she's gone?" Lauren froze. The words hung between them, heavy and unshakable. Ethan let out a bitter laugh, but there was no humor in it. "I mean, think about it. I've been coming here for weeks. I've been walking straight to this house, to this room. Something inside me remembers, even if my mind doesn't. What does that say about me?" Lauren's stomach twisted. "You don't know that, Ethan. We don't know that." He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling shakily. I don't want to know. Lauren took a step closer. You don't have a choice. Ethan looked at her then, really looked at her, and for the first time since this nightmare began, she saw it. The terror of a man who feared his own past. And then a sound, a creak from somewhere in the house. Lauren's entire body went rigid. Ethan stiffened. His eyes darted toward the dark hallway beyond the room. That was the wind, right? Lauren whispered, but even as the words left her lips, she knew better. Ethan swallowed hard. We're not alone. Lauren's breath caught. She turned her head slowly, scanning the shadows beyond the doorway. The house had been abandoned for years. No electricity. No signs of life. Then why did she suddenly feel like someone was watching them? Ethan grabbed her arm, his grip tight. We need to go. Lauren didn't argue. They both moved toward the door, but before they could take another step, a voice, faint, whispered, and coming from inside the house. Lauren's pulse skyrocketed. She turned to Ethan, expecting to see fear on his face. But instead, she saw something worse. Recognition. His entire body went still, his breathing shallow. His lips parted slightly, as if he was about to say something. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he murmured, I remember. Lauren felt her stomach drop. What? Ethan's gaze lifted toward the shadows beyond the doorway. His hands clenched at his sides. His face had gone pale, but his voice was steady. I remember everything. Lauren's body was rigid as she stared at Ethan. His face was pale, his eyes locked onto something invisible beyond the dark hallway. The weight of his whispered words hung between them. I remember everything. For a moment, Lauren thought she might be imagining things, that maybe this was just another episode, another moment of confusion. But the look in Ethan's eyes told her otherwise. This wasn't a fragmented memory surfacing in his sleep. This was clarity. She took a slow, cautious step closer. Ethan, what do you remember? His jaw tightened. His hands clenched at his sides. His breathing shallow but steady. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but firm. I was here the night Rebecca disappeared. Lauren's pulse spiked. She swallowed the knot in her throat, forcing herself to stay calm. Okay, tell me what happened. Ethan exhaled shakily, his eyes flickering to the old wooden chair in the center of the room. Rebecca was my ex-girlfriend. We dated for a while, but things ended badly. She had issues. She was convinced someone was following her, that someone was breaking into her house at night. He let out a bitter laugh. I didn't believe her. I thought she was being paranoid. Lauren listened intently, her chest tightening. One night, she called me. Ethan continued. She was crying, saying that someone was in her house. She begged me to come. His voice cracked slightly. I almost didn't. We hadn't spoken in months. But something in her voice had scared me. Lauren's breath was shallow. So you went. Ethan nodded. When I got here, the front door was unlocked, just like it is now. I found her sitting in this room, in that chair. He gestured toward it. She was terrified. She kept saying, he's been here. He's been in my house. I told her there was no one here, that she needed to calm down. She wouldn't listen. His fingers curled into fists. She kept insisting that someone had been watching her for weeks, that they were waiting for the right time to take her. Lauren felt ice run through her veins. Ethan, was there someone else in the house that night? Ethan's face darkened. I didn't think so, but she swore there was. She said she had locked the doors, but when she woke up, they were unlocked, that her things had been moved, that someone had whispered her name while she was sleeping. Lauren shivered, and then Ethan exhaled sharply. I told her I'd check the house to make her feel better. I walked through every room. I checked the doors, the windows. Everything was locked. I thought maybe she was having a breakdown. I told her I would take her to a doctor in the morning. Lauren's stomach twisted, but she disappeared that night. Ethan's gaze grew distant. I left her alone for 5 minutes. I went outside to check the yard. When I came back, she was gone. Lauren's skin prickled. Gone. He nodded. I searched the entire house. She wasn't here. The front door was wide open. I ran outside. calling her name, but it was like she had vanished. His voice lowered. I didn't call the police. Lauren's heart skipped a beat. Why? Ethan rubbed his face, his breath shaky. Because I thought maybe she had run away. Maybe she was trying to prove a point, trying to scare me. His voice dropped to almost a whisper. And because I was scared they'd think I had something to do with it. Lauren felt like she had been punched in the gut. So you just left? Ethan closed his eyes for a second before nodding. I left. I convinced myself she would come back, that she was just playing some kind of twisted game, but she never did. His voice was barely audible now, and I never told anyone I was here that night. Lauren took a step back, trying to process everything. Ethan had kept this a secret for 10 years, and now his subconscious had led him back to the place where it all happened. There was only one possibility left. Ethan, she said carefully, her voice shaking. If Rebecca didn't run away, where did she go? Ethan's face turned pale. He looked around the room again, as if seeing it for the first time. And then, suddenly, he walked toward the far wall. His hand hovered over a small section of wooden paneling. Lauren's heart slammed against her ribs. He pressed his palm against the panel. It didn't budge. But when he ran his fingers along the edge, he found something, a small indentation. Lauren's entire body was frozen as Ethan reached into his pocket, pulled out his keys, and slid one of them into the gap. A soft click. Then the panel shifted. Lauren's breath hitched. What is that? Ethan didn't answer. He just pulled the panel open. Behind it, in the narrow darkness of a hidden compartment, there was a small human-shaped bundle wrapped in decayed fabric. Lauren choked back a scream. The air turned thick, suffocating. Ethan's face went blank. His body swayed slightly, like a man about to collapse. Oh my God, he whispered. Lauren clapped a hand over her mouth, eyes burning. Rebecca never left. She had been here all along. The realization slammed into her like a freight train. And Ethan, whether he had remembered it or not, had known. She staggered back, her breathing ragged. Her mind screamed at her to run, to get out. But before she could move, Ethan turned to her, his face unreadable. His voice was quiet. Steady. What do we do now? Lauren's hands trembled. She had two choices. Call the police, or keep the secret. Ethan's eyes searched hers, waiting for an answer. The weight of the past pressed down on her, suffocating, inescapable. And then she pulled out her phone and dialed. The silence stretched between them as the call connected. Lauren swallowed a lump in her throat, then spoke the words that would change everything. I need to report crime. Ethan exhaled, his shoulders slumping. He didn't resist. He didn't speak, because deep down he had known all along. The past never stays buried.